Hello everybody, my name is Paul and welcome to the Stormkeep. I'm going to be doing a quick tips video today about Translocation. Translocation has been a staple in the Stormcast army box for many editions now, dating back to 1st edition when it was called Lightning Chariot, and in 4th edition it feels stronger than ever before, not just because it allows us to do lots and lots of crazy plays, but it also allows us to deny enemy battle tactics if you're very good with it. Before we start the video, I'd like to give a shout out to the sponsor of this episode, Mindtaker Minis. A community-focused shop in Vancouver, Washington, they provide space for local clubs and groups for wargaming and RPGs alike. They carry modeling supplies, terrain, dice, and have a sizable collection of 40k, Age of Sigmar, and Warhammer Fantasy in stock. In addition to reselling Warhammer, they will also buy your unused miniatures. If you've got a big pile of shame in the closet, you can turn it into cash or trade it in for store credit. Visit mindtaker.org and use code STORMKEEP5 to get 5% off your next online order. Thank you to Mindtaker Minis for sponsoring this episode, and now on to the show. Let's go over a primer of how to actually use Translocation, and why you would want to use it, because Stormcast do have many other teleport abilities. We have the Stormreach portal that allows us to transport a unit once per turn. We have the Vanguard wing ability. Questers can teleport themselves. We have a lot. We're not shy for teleports. We are definitely the teleporting army, which feels really good. However, Translocate is the only one we have that can be used in the hero phase, which is a very important distinction compared to something like the Stormreach portal happening in the movement phase. Translocate is also the only one that can be used in the enemy turn through magical intervention. Mechanics of Translocation are fairly simple. You make a chanting roll. On a 4+, you get to teleport a unit anywhere more than 9 inches from an enemy unit. You can also have this big Translocate effect on an 8+ that also has -1 to hit. I usually forget about this, honestly. It doesn't really come into play very often. The main value of Translocation is being able to reposition your units. What makes Translocation more interesting is that it's a prayer, and prayers have a cool mechanic of banking ritual points on the priest. So, for example, you could try to chant a prayer on your turn, resolve it or not, you can still bank the points. So let's say you roll a 4 and you don't want to use them on your turn, so you just bank the points. And then during the enemy turn, you can roll Magical Intervention on Translocation, and since you have those points banked up, it's effectively a 2+ chant on that Translocate in the enemy turn. You can do really sneaky things like baiting opponents into declaring a battle tactic like Slay the Entourage or take their land, or, potentially do not waver if they're stuck in combat with you and they're expecting a free combat. There's all sorts of ways you can deny tactics using this. Things to keep in mind before we go into the rest of this. Of course, prayers are unreliable. At best, they are a 2+. There's always a 1 in 6 chance of failure. And that, at least for me, is too high of a chance of failure. So I never ever rely on these for any kind of strategy. I always treat it as a bonus. I always try to make sure that I have another plan in case this fails. Translocate is not unlimited. We can only try to chant it once per turn, no matter how many priests we bring. 9-inch charges are unreliable. Never ever rely on them. You should not be forming strategies around making a 9-inch charge when you only have about a 24% chance of making that charge. With a reroll, it goes up to about 47-48%, but it's still not reliable enough. You also do not want to rely on Translocate to score your battle tactics. If you have positioning-based tactics, such as take their land or seize the center, or you're trying to steal an objective in the enemy territory, use the Stormreach portal instead. It does not require a dice roll. Let's take a look at some very simple examples of using Translocation. The first one here is to translocate units out of combat. Translocate is not a retreat ability. Units that were translocated do not count as having used a retreat ability, so they can still shoot and charge as normal. So this is very useful in units like the Chariot, or Fulminators, or Stormdrake Guard, units with charge bonuses, specifically things like charge +1 damage, or the Chariot mortal wounds that it does when it charges into combat. If you teleport them out of combat, they can charge back in later and get those bonuses. But of course, 9-inch charges are not reliable, so this is not the best strategy. The best units to translocate are generally shooting units, so you can reposition them and get the right angle at the right time. In this example, the Vigilors are within 3 inches of the Agrodon Lancers that charge into the Chariot. In order for them to shoot, they would have to retreat and then shoot on the following turn. However, if you translocate them out of combat, they will be able to shoot freely because Translocate does not count as a retreat ability. Another use of Translocate is to deny space before your opponent can set up units. This is obviously a little bit more complex than just repositioning your own units around because you're trying to predict what your opponent is doing, but let's look at an example I used in a previous video. In this case, the Lumineth player deployed in a castle formation with no screen on the right side. They were intending to have Teclis summon a Gravetide in order to block me from setting up units such as prosecutors or shooting units and protect his sentinels that are in the back of his castle. In this case, the Stormcast player chanted Translocate and put a Lord Arcanum in that space before Teclis had a chance to use Magical Intervention. This means the Gravetide cannot be summoned in that space, and therefore the prosecutors cannot be denied from setting up there, or shooting units could be put down there. And then later, the Lord Arcanum teleported away in the movement phase. Because there is a very specific window where Teclis is able to cast spells, the Lord Arcanum was occupying that space at that time. Using that same example, in this case, the Stormcast player also decided to use a spell ability before teleporting away in the movement phase. Because the Lord Arcanum is a wizard, he was able to try to cast a spell. In this case, he tried to cast Soul Snare Shackles because it would have done a lot of damage and reduced his movement speeds, but that spell was unbound by Teclis. Regardless, the Lord Arcanum then teleported away. You can see he's actually within 3 inches of a place of power, and he teleported back wholly within 12 inches of a Lord Relictor, so he can do it all over again in the following turn. Except this time with +1 to cast. Let's look at some simpler examples for casting a spell after translocating a unit. Let's say you have a Krondys, and he's trying to cast one of his spells that have an 18-inch range like Atavistic Tempest or Starfall or an Endless Spell. Currently, as you can see on the screen, he is out of 18 inches, but if you translocate him forward, he will be within range to cast his spells. Krondys was actually teleported pretty far forward here so that he can cast the Soul Snare Shackles behind the enemy front line. This will allow him to hit all 3 units that are shown here. The Battlesmith, the Rune Master, and the Volkite Berserkers will all take D3 damage and have their movement speed reduced. And then because this is a precarious position, we also drop some Bodyguard Praetors into play so that on the following turn, any other units that come towards Krondys have a tougher time taking down the dragon. Praetors can be dropped anywhere into play with Signs of the Storm, and they're able to use their Soul Bond ability while they're in reserve. So it doesn't really matter where you translocate Krondys to, he could be anywhere around the board, and then the Praetors can be dropped in right beside him. Let's say instead of a monster, what if we used an infantry hero? Infantry heroes are a lot more interesting because they can use the Stormreach portal. So with a little bit more foresight, you could, for example, teleport a Knight Arcanum into range. The Knight Arcanum could cast a spell, and then use Step Through the Portal to get back into a safe spot. This is a much cheaper investment, although obviously not as reliable as Krondys casting with +2, the Knight Arcanum can still get some work done for a much, much lower point cost. Another interesting use of Translocate is to get out of range of unbind abilities. In this scenario, the Knight Arcanum wants to cast Starfall on the Kroxigors in order to reduce their threat range. However, the Knight Arcanum is within 30 inches of the Skink Starseer on the left side, who can try to unbind the spell. I like to play in a way that reduces the amount of dice both players roll, make everything as reliable as possible. Although it is a dice game, we want to reduce the variance so that we have a higher chance of success. The Knight Arcanum is translocated such that they are still within 18 inches of the Kroxigors to hit them with Starfall, but outside of 30 inches of the Skink Starseer, so they can no longer use an unbind ability on the spell. Although the spell can still fail, at least we're getting rid of the chance for it to fail from an additional dice roll. Another great use of Translocate is translocating units and then using Rally on them, because both of these are hero phase abilities and they can be done in any order. Rally cannot be used in combat, and there are units like Prosecutors that take Rally very well. If they somehow survive combat on the previous turn, you can translocate them out and then rally them. These Prosecutors were left in combat with some Kroxigors, and without the charge +1 damage bonus active, they will be unable to destroy the Kroxigors before they attack, and the Krox will definitely wipe them out because Prosecutors are quite fragile. So we translocate the Prosecutors. In fact, we're going to translocate them wholly within 6 inches of the Stormreach portal, and then we can use Rally to return 2 models to the unit. And then we're going to use the portal again to get back to this location over 9 inches from the Kroxigors, and with a 3d6 charge, we are very likely to get back into combat with the Kroxigors. Now, of course, we didn't need to use the portal in this combo, but let's say you're trying to figure out, how many models are resurrected before you send them out somewhere. The portal gives you an additional option. You don't have to dedicate your translocate into a single spot. But what if we're using units that don't have a 3d6 charge, like Reclusians? They're a lot slower, they don't have any charge bonuses, and if we translocate them out of range, they're unlikely to make a 9-inch charge back into combat. Well, if we translocate them out, and then use Rally, you'll notice that we can pop that model back in, and now the unit is 7 inches away from the enemy rather than 9 inches, and that's a much more reliable charge. Let's take a look at some army scale use of translocation. This is a game I've talked about on the channel before. Stormcast player has committed most of his army to the left side of the battlefield because the Slaanesh player army is split very wide. This will make it difficult to contest the right side of the battlefield later in the game for the Stormcast player because Vigilors and Judicators do not move very fast. They only move 6 and 5 inches respectively. So once the Keeper of Secrets is done cleaning up the Judicators on the right side, that Slaanesh player will basically own the right side of the battlefield. However, Dracots with their 10-inch move are fast enough to be able to get to the middle of the board in one turn and then to the other side of the board in a further turn. And because I have Translocate available with both of the shooting units in range, able to reposition into the other side of the battlefield as necessary. Lord Relictor in this example is also within 6 inches of the Stormreach portal, so they can be teleported anywhere they need to be. I believe in this case the Vigilors were also wholly within 12 of the Stormreach portal, so they can move 6 inches into range of it, be teleported away, and then still be able to shoot. Let's look at another example of where Translocate can be comboed with other positioning abilities to get out of a very, very bad spot. If you're looking at this board setup right now, you can see that the Stormcast player has massively committed most of his army into one corner of the battlefield. If you're curious why this position exists, you can check out Battle Report on the Stormkeep Discord server about the Dracoline's last ride. Regardless, this is a very bad position to be in, because the Orc player can now just run the entire board. You can see the only things left outside of the bottom left corner are a unit of Questers and a unit of 5 Vigilors that are off the battlefield currently. This gives the Iron Just player complete control of the battlefield. However, with Translocation and Soulscream Bridge, the shooting units are able to be teleported into useful positions in future turns. For example, in this game, the 6 Castigator block was translocated into cover, and then in range to shoot multiple enemy units, such as the Prize Beast in the middle, and then that special character, the one that breaks wards, I forget his name off the top of my head. And then the smaller unit of 3 Castigators was moved into range of the bridge, they teleported to the other side of the bridge, and then they were in range to shoot at the cavalry unit in the middle of the board. Now, from this position, they could have also used the Stormreach portal to teleport anywhere, but in this case, it wasn't necessary. I wanted them in the middle in order to shoot the pigs. Let's take a look at a couple examples of how to use Magical Intervention with Translocate. First up is an example of how to take their land, or not cancel, that's not really the right word for it. We're trying to make it less likely. So let's say in this case, the Stormcast player, they're relying on reserves and teleports to take their land, because they picked a piece of terrain that was far away from the units that are currently on the battlefield, and they have no other way to get there. What you can do with Magical Intervention, you can either summon a unit in range of it, or you can translocate a unit in range of it to deny setups within 9 inches. Now, instead of just getting the tactic guaranteed, they have to rely on a 9-inch charge, and then surviving the combat phase and getting control of that piece of terrain. This, of course, is not something unique to Translocate, but it is worth mentioning. What is unique to Translocate is a strategy like this. Putting a small unit down on an objective, and then translocating it away in the enemy turn. This is something that comes in handy in a lot of my games. I like to build lists that have 3 regiments, and because I typically have more regiments than my opponent, I'm frequently made to go first at the top of round 1, because people know just how devastating a Stormcast double turn is, and they don't want to give me that option. In situations like that, I can drop a small size unit of, let's say, 3 Castigators on an objective wholly within 12 inches of a Knight Relictor. So in this game in particular, the Knight Relictor banked 3 ritual points in the hero phase, which then allowed me to drop 3 Castigators from reserve onto the bottom objective, within 15 inches to shoot the Paladors, and then wholly within 12 inches of the Relictor. In the enemy turn, I can use Magical Intervention to have a 2+ to translocate those Castigators to safety. In this case, it didn't work out for me, but hey, it's a dice game. What can you do? And that'll do it for this quick tips video. Hopefully I kept this one under 20 minutes. I keep saying I'm going to do that, but hey, I think I actually pulled it off this time. If you have any tips or tricks for using Translocate, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. I'll be reading them every day. If you want to talk about AOS, join the Stormkeep Discord server. You can also consider supporting us here on the Stormkeep by becoming a member on YouTube or joining us on patreon.com/thestormkeep. For $5 a month, you can get early access to all our videos and access to the slides that we use in all our videos. That's going to do it for this video. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.